Hello, everyone. Great to be with you again for our weekly podcast, Palestine This Week, where we try to unpack the key issues from Palestine and the wider region. I am joined, as always, by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani. Mouin, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me, Nassim, and it's always a pleasure.
Likewise, and Maureen, I want to kick off where we began last week. We began with a discussion on the so-called humanitarian city. There's been a lot of pushback against that, condemnation of that, not least by a former Israeli prime minister. We will get to that later on. There seems to be a pattern emerging of how Israel is going about this plan of creating a concentration camp. Palestinians, as we discussed last week, are being herded into the south, where they're forced to move to the south, and how they are being forced, we will discuss later on as well. And one of the ways doing that is by creating these no-go areas, these zones of places where if Palestinians were to enter, they would be basically shot and killed. And the question many would ask is, how will Palestinians know where the borders of these kill zones are? They actually don't. And there's a report that was just published by Plus 972 magazine, which said that, when enough Palestinians are killed for entering into a specific dead zone or an area that is restricted to Palestinians, they will learn the lessons. They will get to know that this is actually restricted for Palestinians. Therefore, they should not go into that area. So I want to begin with that report itself, the Plus 972 magazine, which carried out this amazing investigation into this latest phase of Israel's genocide on Gaza. And the report itself, the investigation, looked at how Israel is repurposing, weaponizing commercial Chinese drones to attack Palestinians in areas outside the concentration camps. So effectively, bombing them and depopulating the areas and herding them into the south. And one of the things I found really shocking in that report is that dogs, which have been feeding on Palestinian corpses, as soon as they hear a bomb going off, they would rush to the area where they hear a bomb, knowing that there will be dead corpses to eat. And that was covered by the report itself. And I found that really, really shocking. So let's begin with that report and how it lays out the current phase of Israel's genocide on the Gaza Strip.
Well, just to begin with your last point, anyone who is familiar with dogs or other pets would know that when they experience the sounds of heavy explosions, fireworks, and so on, they tend to get anxious and run away from the scene rather than towards it. But here, as you point out, they have come to associate explosions with corpses with food, and so they rush towards these sites and start eating the corpses of dead Palestinians. 972 magazine, and in this case, once again, its outstanding reporter Yuval Abraham, who's parenthetically also a co-winner of the Oscar last year for best documentary, which of course caused massive outrage and so on among the Hospital Symphony Orchestra. He has produced yet another sterling report, this time about Israel's massive use and repurposing of drones. The report points out that when Israel's genocidal onslaught on the Gaza Strip began on October 7th, 2023, immediately after the Hamas attacks into southern Israel, that Israel had a shortage of drones, and it raised large amounts of funds from the Israeli public, from the U.S., from its supporters in the U.S. So not the government, but from citizens and organizations, and was able to use this money to buy large amounts of Chinese drones. I think they're called Evo drones. And these drones are specialized in photography, and they were initially used for surveillance purposes in order to get a better view of the area in which the genocide was being conducted. But then at some point, Israel's military engineers discovered that they could actually attach hand grenades to these Chinese commercial drones and use them basically as unmanned bombers. And they have been using them so intensively that the report describes areas within the Gaza Strip controlled by Israeli forces that have been transformed into drone airports with these drones constantly taking off and landing and being resupplied with additional explosives. And this has been very important to Israel because these Chinese commercial drones can be had for a fraction of the price of the more sophisticated military drones in the Israeli military. Now, what this report conveys in excruciating detail is how these drones are also being used to implement the demographic engineering campaign of Israel in the Gaza Strip. So, for example, a certain area will be marked for death and destruction, and as soldiers testify to Yuval Abraham in this report, which I should add is not behind a paywall. Plus 972 magazine, put that in your search engine, and you can easily read this outstanding report by yourself. Soldiers explain that basically anything that moves is considered a legitimate target, even if they can clearly see that the object, that the person is unarmed, even if they can clearly see that the person is a child, and there's an incident of a child riding a bike getting killed this way. And there is no requirement that that the person being murdered present a threat in any way. Of course, in most cases, they're far out of reach of the soldiers doing the killing. And then the second main point that is raised in this report is that in addition to these kill zones, there are also exclusion zones. In other words, areas from which Palestinians are banned from entering. These boundaries are not conveyed to the Palestinians, and the way these boundaries are enforced, as soldiers explained to Yuval Abraham, is when enough people have been killed for approaching these red lines, then Palestinians will understand that they enter these areas at their own peril. It's the old adage of kill one, teach 100. So an absolutely genocidal, perverse, depraved way of conducting warfare, even in the context of the absolutely genocidal, perverse, and depraved campaign that Israel has been conducting since early October 2023.
I guess it's worth pointing out that the Ukrainians have also repurposed these Chinese-made drones against Russia. And I assume it's not to this degree or this volume, I suspect. As a result, China banned the sale of such drones to Ukraine. So I wonder, do you think, China, after seeing this report, will now think about banning the sale of its commercial drones to Israel, knowing that Israel is repurposing them for the purpose of committing genocide in Gaza?
Well, they certainly should, and one would hope that they do. But if I recall correctly, the report also points out that many of these drones are not published, sorry, rather, are not purchased directly by the Israeli military, but are ordered, for example, on websites like Amazon. So, while morally and politically, of course, this is absolutely what China should do, and that there's a clear precedent for it doing so. I think there's also questions to be raised about how effective such a decision would be in practice.
And another factor in the herding and forcing the Palestinians to south is the weaponization of food. And we got another um, indication of how that's being carried out by another report by Forensic Architecture. And it showed in clear detail how Israel has systematically destroyed the civilian and UN network of aid distribution centers, forcing Palestinians to use the GHF Gaza Humanitarian Foundation set up by the US and Israel. So where Palestinians in the early on in the genocide in Gaza had something like 400 aid distribution centers to go to, run by the UN and various other civilian NGOs and organizations. Now they are limited to just 3 in the south.
Four,
There
I
was
believe.
4.
Three
Well,
in
I
the
think
south and one in the center.
yeah,
Sorry
and
for
1 in the center.
interrupting.
Yeah, so 4. So this is again gives you another indication of how this is exactly being carried out, denying food, weaponizing food, forcing Palestinians into a small concentration camp in the south. And I think the forensic architecture gives us another layer of this, how this policy has been
Yes.
implemented.
Yeah, and if I could just make one final point about previous topic we discussed. The report in Plus 972 magazine doesn't get into this, but given that such a large proportion of funds for the purchase of these drones is coming from contributions from organizations and individuals in the United States, given what we just discussed about China's obligations to cease such exports, it's also noteworthy that Americans can now participate in genocide tax-free. In other words, the monies they are given, that they are providing for the purchase of these drones, which are directly used to perpetrate genocide, are under US law considered charitable tax-free contributions. And I think that's worth keeping in mind as well. Regarding the report you just mentioned, Forensic Architecture, which is headed by an Israeli architect and planner, E.L. Weitzman, and that has put out a number of really groundbreaking reports over the years, has now just published a new one. The main conclusion of which is that because of these issues that you just mentioned, even a ceasefire would not end the genocide. The reason being that Israel is now in total control of the delivery of humanitarian supplies to the Palestinian population of the Gaza Strip, and has thoroughly weaponized the aid distribution system, so that, as you mentioned, any Palestinian who wants to get a bag of rice or flour or anything that is required for sustenance cannot get it in the northern Gaza Strip and has to travel either to the central region or to the southern region. And therefore, the weaponization of aid has as a primary purpose the forced relocation of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian civilians from the north, and increasingly to concentrate them in a camp on the ruins of what was formerly the city of Rafah and the Rafah refugee camp. In other words, Israel is openly constructing a ghetto, a concentration camp on the ruins of the Gaza Strip as a prelude to their forced expulsion from Palestine altogether. And the main point made by this forensic architecture report is that so long as Israel is permitted to remain in control of the aid distribution effort, it will continue weaponizing it to compel the forced relocation of Palestinians from throughout the Gaza Strip to Rafah. And under such conditions, even a ceasefire that Israel actually respects, would not end the genocide, because we're past that point now. And I think it's for those who continue to make claims that the purpose of GHF is to provide assistance to Palestinians, or that Israel is delivering aid to Palestinians more efficiently than the United Nations, and so on. It's worth noting that reports are now written that explicitly identify GHF as an instrument of genocide, and that it is so deeply implicated in genocide that its role would continue even in the context of a comprehensive cessation of hostilities.
Now, looking back, having read those two reports, you can see why Israel very early on began to criticize UNRWA and the whole United Nations aid distribution network. I think very early on, even before the war, I think if there was an opportunity to carry out genocide in Gaza, Israel realized that they would need to dismantle the aid distribution
Yes.
of the United Nations, isolate the UN, take control of aid, and use aid as a weapon of war. And you can see incrementally how the way they've gone about doing that, delegitimizing the UN and Western countries backing Israel in this effort, you can see why this has been so successful and how this was kind of planned all the way. And if you looking back in hindsight, it was is all obvious to begin with.
Yeah. Well, yes, and specifically, I mean the Israeli and for that matter, U.S. and to a certain extent European campaign against UNRWA is very long standing. It predates October 2023 by many years, and the main purpose of this slanderous campaign against UNRWA has nothing to do with aid, has nothing to do with Hamas. Its purpose is that UNRWA is seen as the most visible surrogate of Palestinian refugees and their right of return to their former homes under international law. UNRWA, of course, is an aid agency and not a political organization. The rights of Palestinian refugees and promoting those rights are not really within its mandate. But, you know, in the crazy world of Israel flunkies and their apologists and loyalists abroad, the only reason there are Palestinian refugees is because of UNRWA. And in their twisted thinking, you get rid of UNRWA, you get rid of the Palestinian refugee question. That began to change in October, because before October, where Israel's policy was to keep Palestinians in the Gaza Strip on the brink of starvation but alive, UNRWA actually played an important role, and the Israelis and Americans and others issued these very contradictory messages of, on the one hand, constantly criticizing and condemning UNRWA, but at the same time giving it the funds and resources required to fulfill its mandate. In October, of course, Israel immediately implemented a watertight siege of the Gaza Strip, and at certain points it had to either relax or lift that siege, and UNRWA and other professional aid agencies were able to conduct their activities. But then last year, Israel hit upon the idea of getting rid of these organizations altogether and seizing control of the aid distribution mechanism by itself in order to weaponize food, in order to weaponize medicine, in order to weaponize water, and so on, and realize that if it could successfully delegitimize and demonize these organizations and comprehensively prohibit any activity by them in the Gaza Strip and bring them under the rubric of its genocidal partner in crime, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, then it could make aid part of its military campaign precisely in order to achieve the strategic objectives which we've been discussing today and indeed over the past few months.
Two stories I want to get your thoughts on. First is a comment by former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Olmert, who said that the Humanitarian City is actually a concentration camp. He used that term itself, very controversial in Israel and elsewhere. But he said it is a concentration camp. He was accused of being an Iranian asset for saying that.
Who isn't?
And yeah, um, and also Omar Barto, I mean, who is an Israeli professor of genocide studies. Today, he published an opinion piece in the New York Times where he said that I am a genocide scholar. I know when I see it. And then he gave his explanation. But what's interesting for me is that now the New York Times has offered his platform to someone like Omar Bartov. Earlier on, he published, I think a year ago, an article in The Guardian, again in the similar uh, vein, where he explained his change in position from the beginning of the genocide to when he didn't think it was a genocide, but to when he became absolutely convinced that what Israel was doing is committing genocide in Gaza. So now the New York Times has published a piece by Omar Bartov, who, as I said, is an Israeli professor. And an interesting point he made is that one of the hardest thing to prove is intent. But he explain, provides evidence after evidence showing intent to commit genocide by Israel. But intent isn't the only way to determine whether genocide is being committed or not. You can also look at the operations on the ground. And he goes on to say that, looking at the operations on the ground over the past 2 years, there is no other way to describe this other than to say that Israel is systematically committed to the destruction of Gaza and is committing genocide. So I thought that was an
Yeah.
interesting shift, not just simply intent, but the way and the manner in which Israel is committing its war crimes in Gaza leads him to
Yes.
conclude it's genocide.
Yes, I mean, last week we discussed how even Israeli lawyers who rose to Israel's defense and were representing it at the International Court of Justice when it was accused of perpetrating genocide by South Africa, even some of these people have now openly accused Israel of conducting genocide. And it would be interesting to hear more about these people from, what happened. You were basically smearing and mocking anyone who was telling the truth in late 23, early 24, and now you want to get out front ahead of the pack. There's something wrong here. Omer Bartov, by contrast, is an interesting case. Um, when the genocide first began, he was not convinced that what Israel was conducting in the Gaza Strip did in fact constitute genocide. But he was, not the loudest critic in the room. He explained why he felt it did not rise to the level of genocide. And then I believe it was over a year ago. In other words, he didn't wait till everyone else changed their mind, and all of a sudden, it became acceptable to question whether or not Israel was committing genocide. He wrote this very long account essay in the UK paper, The Guardian, explaining precisely how and why he came to the conclusion that his initial assessment was wrong, or rather that conditions had caught up with his definition of, or with the definition of genocide, as far as he was concerned. And he now felt that that was the appropriate conclusion to reach. Significant because Bartov is considered one of the world's leading scholars of the German Holocaust and of genocide more generally. So, this New York Times opinion piece is more notable for, as you mentioned, it being published in the New York Times than it being written by Omer Bartov, for the reason that, as we discussed, Bartov did not reach this conclusion yesterday morning. He's held it for a year. Now, if even the New York Times is running is running opinion pieces clearly labeling Israel's military campaign as a genocide, can its reporting be far behind? I suspect there won't be any change in the reporting anytime soon. But perhaps a more important question: can the BBC be far behind? my expectation is that the BBC will remain very, 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 very far behind and will continue in its punishment campaign against anyone who seeks to tell the truth about what Israel is doing rather than dedicate itself to reporting the truth about what Israel is doing. Um, the other issue that you mentioned,
Yeah, I mentioned. I mean, you don't have to comment on. I mean, it was Ehud Olmert who said
yes,
who described the situation on the ground as it is. He described it as a concentration camp, and I thought that was quite a development, given he is a former prime minister, and
yes.
pro-Israelis tend to not use that term, even though that's a reality on the ground. But he wasn't shying away from using the term concentration camp, and of course he was slammed for it. His Iranian asset,
Yes.
Qatari asset, and whatnot.
Yeah, no, I really don't have anything to add to the points you made. You know, here again, the factual content of Olmed's statement has been, you know, intuitively obvious to anyone who has eyes and ears for some time. But significant that even former Israeli heads of government are now coming to this conclusion. And the question is, you know, to what extent is he serving as a surrogate, for example, for leaders in the Israeli security establishment who don't want to see the Israeli military get involved in this scheme, not for moral or political reasons, but for practical reasons that they don't think this is an appropriate use of Israel's military resources. It should concentrate on killing and murder and genocide, you know, not on administering a ghetto. I'm sure in the 1940s, you know, you had similar views among German officers who basically said, you know, we should be rushing to Moscow, not administering a ghetto in Warsaw.
Yeah. So we hear, of course, a lot about Israel's influence in the US, but I think we rarely talk about the Israelization of America. I mean, I use that phrase intentionally because last week, as we know, a American Palestinian was killed by Israeli settlers in the occupied West Bank. Saifullah Kamal Musallat, he was basically beaten to death by Israeli
Lynched. Mm,
lynched. Yeah, he was lynched.
mm.
That's the proper word for it. And we saw in how the American government responded when U.S. citizen Aiden Alexander, who was abducted by Palestinians. Aiden Alexander served in the Israeli occupation forces, and he was abducted, and the length to which the Trump administration went to secure his release. We saw the extent to which they did that. And here we have again a Palestinian citizen of America who was lynched. And I guess one would, and we've not really heard anything, and one would assume, that America has two-tier citizenship, which is exactly what Israel has. And I think this is an example of the Israelization of America, where America sees one group of citizens as having lesser rights than other groups of citizens. So just wanted to get your thoughts on the fact that, there's such a double standard when it comes to Palestinian Americans being lynched and killed, whereas when an Israeli soldier who's an American citizen was abducted, America went to great lengths to secure his release.
Yeah, no, it's an obvious double standard. I mean, Saif Musallat from Tampa, Florida, if I'm not mistaken, ran an ice cream store there. Was beaten to death by a settler lynch mob in the West Bank, and um, crickets, total silence from the U.S. government. My own expectation had been that. Um, the U.S. would congratulate Israel, but they chose to say nothing, and this, of course, conforms to a consistent pattern by U.S. governments when Israel murders U.S. citizens, and as you know, this is hardly unique to the Trump administration. You may recall when Israel murdered in a premeditated killing the iconic Palestinian journalist Shirin Abu Akleh, who is also a U.S. Citizen. Blinken um, went into overdrive to engineer a cover up on Israel's behalf. So, the U.S. likes to flex its muscles and talk tough about consequences for any state or government that harms or kills a U.S. citizen. It's absolute nonsense. Um, if if a U.S. citizen is harmed or killed by a adversary of the United States or an individual who's blacklisted by the United States, then of course the full resources of the U.S. government are mobilized to hold that person accountable. But if such murders take place by U.S. allies, and particularly by its favorite foreign proxy, Israel, then all the available resources of the US government are mobilized to ensure that there is impunity and that there is no accountability. And as we saw with Antony Blinken, uh, the government will mobilize everything it can to ensure there's a cover up of the killing. So that's the way, unfortunately, that the United States works. And now we have also another incident in there was a pogrom in the village of Turmosaiya in the West Bank a few weeks ago, where the majority of residents of that village are actually U.S. citizens. And again, not a word from the U.S. Government. And related to this, last week, there was another settler pogrom in the village of Taibe in the West Bank. Now, Taibe is notable because although there are Palestinian Christians throughout the West Bank, Taibe, to the best of my knowledge, is the only village where it is an entirely Christian population center. And these settlers rampaged through the village, set fire to a church, and so on. And what was a response of the self-proclaimed champion of Christianity, Mike Huckabee, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, perhaps better characterized as Israel's ambassador to the Trump administration? Absolutely nothing. For these fanatic Christian Zionists, the persecution of Palestinian Christians by Israel is acceptable collateral damage on the road to Armageddon. That's the world we live in, not in the first century, in the 21st century.
Mm. You mentioned the village of Tabi. This is one of the it has one of the oldest graveyards and monasteries. Apparently, this is also the place where Jesus Christ sought refuge. So, Christian nationalist Huckabee, who is also evangelical Christians, as you mentioned, despite the destruction, setting fire of Palestinian Christian villages, there's been no comment from him or any Christian nationalist in the US. I mean, I don't need. I mean, I just you mentioned. Yeah, so I think I just wanted to add that point. Moving
If
on.
I may, Nassim, these self-proclaimed champions of Christianity, these Christian Zionists, they would gladly see every last Palestinian Christian slaughtered, if that's what's required to make way for Israeli annexation and Armageddon and the Second Coming and all of that. And the irony, of course, is that Palestine is a birthplace of Christianity. The first Christians on earth emerged in Palestine. And now you have some cowboy from Arkansas, from a country that's less than 300 years old, coming to tell Christians in the Middle East that they should basically get on their knees for the U.S.'s favorite foreign proxy. It's beyond words.
And talking about the Israelisation of America, we spoke last week about this racist campaign against Zohran Mamdani, who's standing to be the mayor of New York. So one of the attempts is to strip him of his citizenships, to block him from running for the US mayor. So, I mean, I mentioned that because over in Israel, you have Arab member of Knesset, Ayman Odeh, who is again subjected to similar campaign to expel him from parliament. Odeh has written an opinion piece in Harrods, and I want to get your thoughts on his on this opinion piece. But again, I think that there is a kind of Israelization of American politics, where an American citizen who stands to become a public official is somehow blocked or being denied, or there is a campaign to deny that because he's seen as less of a citizen, he's seen as an other. There's a racialization of American citizens. It's just this carbon copy of what Israel does to its citizens. There's a hierarchy of citizenship, so which is why I'm using this term, Israelization of
Yeah,
American
well
politics.
put. Well, what's interesting about Mamdani, if I could just say one thing about that, is that of course he's being denounced and smeared and all the rest of it as a communist, as a jihadi, as a communist jihadi, and a jihadi communist. But you look at many of his most vociferous opponents, and for them, the mere fact that he was born Muslim is sufficient to disqualify him. It doesn't matter what he thinks, um, uh, a Muslim should not be an elected official in the United States. It is illegitimate for a Muslim to be the mayor of New York. I mean, imagine what would happen if these same people began making the exact same statements, but substituting Jew for Muslim. We can't have a Jew as mayor. He's a Jew, therefore he should be deported, and so on. There would be universal outrage. But in the United States, this has become mainstream discourse. I should add on both the right and the left. You look at the Democratic Party establishment, there's not that much to distinguish them from their Republican colleagues on this issue. And as you mentioned, it's in part, of course, the Israelization of U.S. politics. In Israel, Palestinian nationalist parties are illegal, and they have been repressed since the 1950s. I'm not talking about um, uh, PLO and so on, but parties within Israel that seek to form themselves as political parties, for example, to contest elections and so on. But some parties, of course, have formed. There's a coalition known as Hadash, which includes a joint Arab Jewish Communist Party and some others. And Ayman Odeh is a prominent member of the Israeli parliament of this coalition, and he published an opinion piece in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, basically taking an anti-war position, basically calling for a ceasefire. I can't recall in detail what he said, but nothing particularly, he didn't say anything that hasn't been said by Israeli Jewish commentators, and the most radical statement he made in that opinion piece is imperceptible compared to the constant avalanche of genocidal speech being given by other members of the Israeli parliament. Nevertheless, this is Israel. An Arab said something we don't like. So they started impeachment proceedings against him. And surprisingly, they failed, and Ayman Hodi remains a member of the Israeli parliament. But I wouldn't at all be surprised if there are further efforts to expel him from the parliament.
Let's turn our attention to some of the wider discussions around Palestine. And I want to begin with the news of President Emmanuel Macron, who is now not expected to be at a UN summit for the recognition of a two-state solution. I think it was the French and the British who initiated this process, but now it turns out that having missed the first deadline for a conference because of Israel's 12-day war with Iran, Macron will not be attending the conference at the end of this month, 28th, 29th of July. And apparently, he is now indicating, the French president, that a ceasefire in Gaza is going to be a precondition for France to recognize a state of Palestine. That's not something you mentioned earlier, which many are saying is kind of a gift to Netanyahu. All he needs to do is, if he wants to prevent a Palestinian state, all he needs to do is make sure that there is no ceasefire. That's another way of looking at this, I guess. So, yeah, your thoughts on Macron's U-turn, I guess. That's what it looks like.
Yeah, many people are accusing French President Emmanuel Macron of making a U-turn. I'm not convinced because I didn't see any indications that he ever intended to recognize Palestinian statehood. This began as, in fact, a French-Saudi joint initiative to convene an international meeting at the UN headquarters in New York at the end of June about a two-state settlement. And Macron at the time said that France was considering recognizing Palestinian statehood. He never said they would. He hedged his bets from the very outset. And in an article I wrote at the time, said it was more likely than not that France would not recognize such statehood. And what appeared to be the case is that France wants to march in lockstep with the United Kingdom on this matter, and that as long as Britain won't recognize Palestinian statehood, which I don't expect it ever will, even 50 years after a Palestinian state is actually a reality on the ground, France won't either. France wants to work in a broader European, EU, or otherwise context. And then, as you mentioned, the conference was canceled because of Israel's war against Iran. And now it has been rescheduled, but this time the French president, who was supposed to attend in late June, has indicated he won't be attending. So is precisely what one expects from European leaders. They will never do anything to harm their favorite child, Israel. Israel is their creation, for God's sake. They have been coddling it since 1948, and they're never going to do anything to hurt, to hurt their offspring. Um, even recognition, is considered unjust punishment. So I was never convinced that France was going to recognize Palestinian statehood, and now we have the proof that Macron won't even bother to attend this conference that he kept touting as some major international development. It's obviously no more than hot air, and in my view, was never intended as anything other than hot air.
And picking up on your point about Israel being Europe's favorite child, so last week we spoke about the EU-Israel Association Agreement. There was a report that was conducted by the European Union, and it concluded that Israel was in violation, and it was contemplating imposing some punitive measures, but it hadn't decided what those measures would be. This weekend, it turns out that the European Union's coordinator for combating anti-Semitism, someone by the name of Catherine von Schnurbein.
Baroness Katharina
She,
von
okay,
Schnurbein.
Schnurbein, sorry. So she's been campaigning vigorously against imposing any kind of sanctions or punitive measures against Israel, saying such an approach would be anti-Semitic. I mean, it's so transparent, but it works. And works because the European Union has not decided on what to do with its own report, which concluded that Israel is committing, violating the EU-Israeli Association Agreement, not to mention genocide and everything else.
You know, Baroness Katharina von Schnurbein, a German aristocrat, who has been appointed, I think, the EU High Representative for making sure her own country doesn't. Anyway, she's an EU anti-Semitism Tsar, or whatever it's called, had a conference call with the EU representatives, either the ambassadors to Israel or the
That's
representatives
right.
to the Palestinian Authority, or both. I'm not sure.
Ambassadors to Israel. Yeah.
Yes, ambassadors to Israel, and the notes of this meeting were leaked to newspaper known as a EU Observer, which wrote an article about it, and it's out of this world. Um, this lunatic aristocrat denounces anti-genocide protesters as having been clearly organized and financed by Hamas. Um, and her proof is that they started on October 7th for the simple reason that they started after Israel commenced its genocidal campaign that day. She introduces a new concept, what she calls ambient anti-Semitism. Now, for those unfamiliar with this concept, ambient anti-Semitism is any speech or activity that may make Zionists, not Jews, Zionists, feel uncomfortable. And she gives a very powerful example of ambient anti Semitism and why ambient anti Semitism needs to be eradicated from the face of the earth. She gives the example of a bake sale being held to raise funds for the Irish chapter of the International Committee of the Red Cross to support children in the Gaza Strip. That to me, my friend,
I had to laugh at
is
that
a
point. This is,
nuclear,
yeah. I had to,
it's much
yeah,
more
when I read,
dangerous than an
yeah,
Iranian nuclear weapon.
yeah.
It's so this woman is, I wish I could say she's on drugs, but she's not. She is the genuine representative of Europe and particularly of the European Union. Uh, sure, we're mocking her and others are mocking her, but she represents exactly the unvarnished truth about European official policy towards Palestine and Israel. What she is saying is, in my view, a much better reflection of EU policy than all these others who make these, nice anodyne statements about rules-based international order, Fourth Geneva Convention, so on, and then, turn around and make sure Israel has all the weapons and diplomatic support it needs to conduct its genocide. She is, if you want to know European policy, listen to her, not to the others.
Mm. And I want to contrast the EU's, I guess, abject failure with this new bloc of countries that are seeking to take what they call concrete measures against Israel's violation of international law. So Spain, Ireland, a number of other countries are meeting in Colombia, Bogotá, the capital, Bogotá, for an emergency summit, and it's due to take place today, I think, Tuesday 15th, and tomorrow. And I wanted to get your thoughts on the goals of that. The UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, Francesca Albanese, will be addressing the summit. So you can give your thoughts on the US sanctions on her. We didn't speak about that last week. She was put under sanctions by the US while they lifted sanction on Hayya Tahrir al-Sham and Al-Qaeda offshot. So you can give your thoughts on that, why, and also the 20 country summit who are seeking, as I said, to counter a climate of impunity when it comes to Israel.
Yes, I mean there's a satirical Arabic language website put out a statement or a meme saying, given that the U.S. has just taken Syria's Al-Qaeda affiliate off its list of designated terrorist organizations, if Francesca Albanese wants to see U.S. sanctions lifted, she should join Al-Qaeda, and she would no longer be subject to them. But it's really scandalous, at a time when the European Union has basically unilaterally renounced the Rome Statute by allowing Netanyahu to repeatedly fly over EU airspace on his way to yet another hero's welcome in the United States. And at a time when the U.S. Receives this international fugitive and wanted war criminal, Benjamin Netanyahu, more often than any other head of government or head of state, and is doing everything possible to silence opposition to Israel and so on. It now imposes sanctions on what is really a remarkable moral beacon of our time, the UN Special Rapporteur on the occupied territories, Francesca Albanese, and as she and others have mentioned, she will wear these sanctions as a badge of honor. I'll just make one more point about these scandalous U.S. Measures against UN Special Rapporteur Francesca Albanese. To the best of my knowledge, the UN and its Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, have been absolutely silent about this and have not made public statements either in her support or, more importantly, openly condemning the U.S. For these measures, which again demonstrates, these people live in terror of Washington and have absolutely no clue how one stands up to bullies and really believe that appeasement is somehow going to work. Well, there are others who don't believe that appeasement is an effective response. Among these is the Hague Group, a collection of states and governments whose mission is to make international law, international legal institutions relevant again, particularly as it pertains to the question of Palestine. And Colombian President Petro, sorry, I'm not certain, is hosting a meeting of the Hague Group in the Colombian capital, Bogotá, this week. And Special Rapporteur Albanese, among others, is scheduled to address it. And according to a transcript of her remarks that was made available to the press before she delivered them, she makes very clear that this is not about her. This is about genocide, and the measures against her are a diversion from the issue of genocide. And the key issue is to ensure that complicity comes to an end and that international law is made relevant once more.
Let's conclude with big story from the US. There was a conference by a right-wing platform called Turning Point US, part of the MAGA movement. And during that conference, Tucker Carlson gave a speech where he said that Epstein was a Israeli asset. So that basically blew everything up. And he said that in a week when President Trump said there is no such thing as an Epstein file, he basically dismissed many of the things he said leading up to during the campaign, where he promised to release the Epstein files. And there was all indication that those files do exist. Everyone in his office administration, more or less, said those files exist and they would release them as soon as they, get into power. Now, Trump has turned his back on nearly more than half of his base by doing that. And I would just your thoughts on the cracks within the MAGA base over this. I just want to share my thoughts on
Please.
many of the commentators on this who will say, Trump is obviously not in those files, because if he was in those files, then President Biden, the previous administration, would have used that, weaponized that against him. But I mean, for me, that really doesn't add up, because if we assume Epstein is a foreign asset, then we can assume that there are more Epsteins out there who are using such techniques to blackmail officials and heads of corporations. And Epstein is just a drop in the ocean. And who's to say that there isn't other Epstein? And And the reason Trump is not releasing them is because, we cannot discount the possibility that maybe there are others who are blackmailing him. Of course, we're speculating, but, it doesn't mean just because he's not in the Epstein files, there isn't other, files out there, and Trump is, in those files. Just
Yeah.
sharing my thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. Look, I think we do need to raise questions about Epstein and his foreign relations and so on. I don't think anything has been definitively proven, but I do think there are more than sufficient grounds to ask some serious questions. How did a high school math teacher become a billionaire who has a fleet of private jets, Caribbean islands, friends with all the high and mighty, and so on, purely on the strength of his own business acumen? Well, we've never, what was his business exactly? Um, One of his closest associates was former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak. The main source of his cash was this Les Wexner, if I have his name correctly, who's known as a very prominent supporter of Israel. It has been reported on numerous occasions that he installed video cameras throughout his properties, and not only to keep people outside his properties from entering them. Um, you know, th there are legitimate questions to be raised. Now, if he had been suspected of being an agent for the Russian FSB or China or Qatar, for example, or whatever, um, people would be condemned for refusing to raise these questions. People would be denounced as foreign agents for not wanting to investigate the matter. But because in this case, there are serious grounds for suspicion that he was working on behalf of Israeli intelligence, people are being condemned for raising questions and for wanting those questions answered. Regarding your point about why these files, which clearly do exist, how could they not exist? Why they weren't released during the Biden years? Well, Epstein was an equal opportunity pervert and sexual predator. He was friends and associate not only with Trump, but also with Bill Clinton. He was close with Alan Dershowitz, lest it be forgotten. So, quite clearly, there is very many, very substantial questions that not only need to be asked, but also need to be answered. Will we ever get to the bottom of this? I rather doubt it, but by not conducting these types of investigations, the rumors will continue to fly and only increase. Now, this Turning Point USA MAGA conference is quite interesting because here again, you had an icon of the MAGA right, Tucker Carlson, basically saying that he felt that any American citizen who serves in the Israeli military should lose their citizenship. And there was a complete meltdown. How dare he? Well, imagine if Tucker Carlson had simply said, I believe that any US citizen who serves in a foreign military should have their citizenship revoked. You would have gotten a standing ovation. But when you make the same statement about Israel, all of a sudden you're an anti-Semite, it's blood libel, you want a second Holocaust, and all the rest of it. The problem with Israel and its flunkies is they have had it so good for so long and been coddled so intensively by their sponsors in Israel and Europe that they have become allergic to not only condemnation, but criticism, and not only criticism, but even questioning, even questions that we are required to ask of anyone and everyone else.
Mm. And I've been following the debates in Turning Point, especially Dave Smith and a couple of others. And to the extent you can judge the public sentiment and mood based on the claps and applause, I think Israel has become a pariah even within the MAGA movement. So the applause and the roars of support for someone like Dave Smith and his position criticizing Israel was really something I could not have imagined before 2 years ago.
No.
Yeah. So yeah, let's end on that, Mouin. As always, a pleasure to speak to you. And
Likewise, thank you.
And thank you for tuning in. I hope to see you again next week for another podcast on Palestine This Week. Bye-bye.